as we let our attendees trickle in, I know that both of you are fairly prominent figures in the SEO space, and I know that our audience really, some of them want to know how to level themselves up, how to level up their careers. So my question in terms of an icebreaker to the both of you is, what are some of the moments or things that you did in your SEO career that really kickstarted or, really jumped you up in terms of your path to becoming a SEO expert and influencer in the space? Mike, I'll pass the mic first over to you.
I think, first of all, thanks for having me. Second of all, I want to be more like Tom when I grow up, so we should have started with him. But nevertheless, I started just from like being super curious, right? Like I had a series of jobs while I was also still making music. And I would get these SEO jobs and basically like quit once my boss would piss me off. But I was still really fascinated with the space. And so because I had a background in development, it just made it really fun for me to like try things and build things. And I didn't know much about the SEO community when I first started doing SEO. Like I didn't know that there were conferences. I didn't know any of that really. So I ended up reinventing a lot of wheels on my way to get here. And so that helped me a lot because, I didn't just take things at face value that I found on the web. I built things from my own ideas. And so then by the time I started getting involved in like thought leadership, like writing blog posts and so on, I just had some unique things to say that really helped me stand out. And that turned into me, speaking, and then, just kind of like got the ball rolling from there. So if you're asking me for tips, I would say like become an expert in something or just like really good at something, and then just continue to be curious and share with you what you find. And then you're going to find your community pretty quickly. And then that's going to turn into a lot of opportunity.
I would definitely echo all of that. I think in particular, it's you can think of a lot of people in the industry that have become known for having like a very narrow thing that they are the sort of authority in, whether it be, EAT or I don't know, JavaScript crawling or whatever it might be. And then they might expand from there, or they might just be known as, the name in that space. And I also, the point about sort of curiosity and understanding the fundamentals, I think is important as well, and just to give you a unique voice. I do have a slightly spicy take, which I'd also be interested in Mike's thoughts on, as I think he's been around a little bit longer than me. I've been in SEO since 2012, and my experiences of what I've observed is I think it's gotten harder over time to sort of make a name for yourself in the industry. Like I was very fortunate. I started out at Distilled, who had a big sort of platform of their, or a big voice of their own, and they were able to sort of catapult me ahead, and I was able to stand on top of that platform. So I almost had it on easy mode. But I do think for a lot of people, it has gotten harder, partly because social media has changed. And, the same post that I could make now that would have gotten me, tens of thousands of impressions a few years ago might get, a tenth of that now. And partly because the industry has sort of grown up a bit and also gotten more crowded. That there are already so many big names in SEO that it can be harder now for people to find that niche and find that voice. It's by no means impossible. There are people who've done it in the last few years that have sort of broken out and become recognized names. But I do think it is rarer than it used to be. But yeah, I'd be interested in your take on that, Mike.
So I've been doing SEO since '06, but I didn't get involved in the community till 2011. And, one of the things I did was I reached out to Rand before I knew anybody. And I was like, hey, what do you think I should do to like get started blogging? And he said, you shouldn't. He was like, it's not going to work. It's too oversaturated. But if you are going to do it, focus on a really specific niche. So I think that your perspective was the same that he had at that point, but it didn't stop me, right? I think it really just comes down to, do you have something very compelling to say? Because I know like I'm always looking to see like, okay, what's popping up? Who is talking about things that I don't know about. And a lot of times it's someone I've never heard of. So the thing is that those people aren't necessarily so consistent, right? Like they might drop one or two things and then kind of disappear or just go back to doing whatever they want to do. But for me, like I was like, okay, I'm gonna post something really cool every month, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. So I think it's like anything else, right? Like if even if you want to be like a quote unquote influencer in any other space, it's really just a commitment to content and just waiting until people catch up to everything that you're doing.
It's a great discussion. And I think we got a fully packed room, 85 live attendees. And so let's get this show on the road. We have two amazing panelists with us today. We have Mike King. Mike King is an acclaimed international speaker covering SEO, content strategy, and the impact of generative AI. He's the founder and CEO of the performance marketing agency, iPullRank. He's also launched his debut book, The Science of SEO. Tom is the he heads up the search science team at Moz. So he's always working on Moz's next generation of tools, insights, and products. He's also a speaker, very humble, but knows his stuff when it comes to SEO. I'm going to start us off in terms of a discussion on the Google monopoly ruling that dropped in the last couple of days. So my first question to you is, what do you think content marketers and SEOs should know about that really lengthy document that came out of the Google monopoly ruling? And do you have any expectations that, that case is going to change anything about how SEOs should be thinking about SEO? Mike, I'm gonna start it off handing it to you.
Yeah, I think it's a super fascinating document in general. I think Judge Mehta did a better job of describing how Google works than most SEOs do. And I think just that testimony that they were able to synthesize gave them a lot of inside information, and also gave us as a community a lot of inside information. So, the testimony's been covered a number of times, but there's so much in there with respect to Nav Boost and a number of the other systems that Google has. But we got the definitive answer, like, yes, they are using clicks, they are using user signals, things like that. So if you read that early section of the document, I think you're going to get all the takeaways that you need from like a content marketing and SEO perspective. But I think there's also just some really interesting implications as it relates to, paid search and the integration between the two channels. I think it's really interesting, where the legal system is looking at how Google's moves worked and like why they were bad, right? Like this whole idea that these default search engine deals that they were doing were so anti-competitive, when really when you think about it, it's like, no, why wouldn't you do that? Like, why wouldn't you try to be on all the devices and put your search engine in front of everybody? But from a legal standpoint, when you do it the way they did it, it is a bad thing from a competitive perspective. But you also get all these other little tidbits, right? Like they talk about how the training data or the click log data that Google has and uses as training data is like, what was it, like 17 times the clicks that Bing has. So then they talk about all these different tests that Google did where they like proved like, oh yeah, you can do this with less data. And then the judge was like, well, if that was true, why aren't you guys doing that? That sort of thing. So there's just a lot of fascinating things in there, but I don't know that it's actually going to ever change anything, right? Like if they try to break up Google, just like the government tried to break up Microsoft, Google is of course going to appeal. And even if they did successfully break up Google, Google is already ready to be broken up. Like that's why they did the whole Alphabet thing. So, I think fundamentally, even if they were broken up, let's say like organic search was one company and then, all the advertising was another company, it would still just power it would just still just power how Google works. So I don't know that it's going to change anything at the end of the day. So that's all I got.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think From what I understand, Google is already appealing even this initial judgment, so you can expect, I don't know, years before anything happens. One observation, and I must credit Dr. Pete, who had a great post on this, go live on the Moz blog today. But one observation that he made, which I think is very astute, is that the ruling doesn't really contest that Google is a quality product. It's not like consumers were being given a bad product by being given Google in all of these cases where Google was buying default status. And that creates sort of a challenging environment even if regulators did want to take action against Google as a search engine, because are you going to force, for example, Firefox to put up an inferior default search engine, which would also remove most of Firefox's funding, also create a monopoly in the browser market? This is complex. It's not as clear cut in some ways as like, oh, Internet Explorer on default installed on Windows machines. So yeah, I think something on the ad tech side is maybe more likely, but I also think it's a long way off. I might be getting ahead of the discussion here. I do think in that long run scenario where regulators do something around the ad tech side, I do think that's interesting because from my perspective, that's actually one of Google's toughest moats. Like when I think about how Search GPT or something like that could win, to me, the monetization is maybe the hard bit. Like creating that huge ad infrastructure and that sort of one-stop shop for search ads. Now, I think there was something in the ruling as well about how I think it was Apple said that one of the main reasons they weren't interested in Bing was because of the monetization. Like even if they got a huge revenue share from Bing, that still wouldn't be enough because Bing is so badly monetized. So it's interesting that we think of the search engine as being the really important bit and the bit that Google has done very well, and that may or may not be true. But the ad tech is also like a very deep technical moat that sort of keeps out competitors.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of brilliant stuff within the documents, and I highly encourage y'all to check them out if you have not seen them. I also think Dr. Marie Haynes had a really nice mega thread just kind of walking everyone through, her observations. It is a very, very lengthy document, but a lot of these key themes that, both of you brought up are very relevant, right? It's the fact that, Google is extraordinarily good at monetizing their search engine. They're, of course, very insistent that user engagement signal is ultimately one of the most defining factors that makes Google search good. That, to a degree, is also what one could argue is what makes Google search not great anymore, with its like over-reliance on user engagement signal. So let's talk about user engagement signal, right? Clearly, Google uses it. They have Nav Boost, they have Glue, they have all these kinds of things, and they have all kinds of other systems that they've been releasing that are trying not to depend on user engagement signal. This is MUM, BERT, these kinds of things. Do you see a world in the future where Google is trying to move more away from using user engagement signal and that dependence on that feedback loop? And if you do, what do you think the implications will be for Google search and perhaps AI overviews and Gemini? Mike, I'll pass this to you.
I don't think moving away from that is realistic, right? Like, because it's a fundamental way of how you measure success in information retrieval. That's why I never believed they weren't using clicks to begin with. But the Google whole like gaslighting everyone, like maybe second guess it, but nevertheless, here we are, right? So I think that they have to use it to support the scale at which they operate, because they have way too many queries to just rely on like relevance and links and so on, because those are all things that can be either gamed or yield like false positive information, right? Like I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of variance in what ranks because they've gone in this semantic direction where a lot of us see things that we don't expect because the relevance model semantically is different from the lexical model that we're all like brought up on from an SEO perspective. And so when they make a broad change like that, they have to see what the user impact is to determine whether or not it was successful. So I don't think there's a world where they get rid of that as a signal because it's just too good of a signal, especially at scale, right? Because when you think about how they're measuring it, it's not just like click-through rate, it's not just number of clicks. They're looking at things like, you know, how long does someone hover over a result? They're looking at query reformulation. They're looking at, you know, user looking at several results and coming back and then being like, none of these are good and bouncing entirely. So there's a variety of ways to do click models that they're having to leverage, but it's just such a powerful signal that just makes everything better that I don't think that they can ever get rid of it.
I would bet that some of the least popular or sort of worst perceived Google changes that we've seen in the last few years have happened despite user signal evidence, not because of it. Like when I think of things like AI overviews and when I think of things like the sort of over promotion of Reddit, I feel like those happened because of external pressure on Google, not because their own internal systems were telling them that this was a good idea. I mean, remember a few years ago when there was this whole thing that, oh, you know, you have to put Reddit at the end of your Google query now, and it actually made mainstream news, and supposedly some Google execs were unhappy about it, and now look where we are. And similarly with AI overviews, Google had the technology to build LLM answers for years and specifically didn't want to, and pretty much said that they didn't want to, and then their hand was forced. So I would imagine that despite what they say, for these kinds of changes, they do see negative user feedback in their own, you know, click-based or Chrome metrics, and they're doing it anyway because for whatever reason they feel like they have to.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point when you talk about the fact that they've had the tech for AI overviews for mad long. Because in fact, like there's some overlap in the timing, but when retrieval augmented generation was first like came out in papers, Google had their version of it like a couple months after, right? So like I think RAG was like either 2020 or like 2021, and then Google had like a series of papers. It was like Realm, Retro, and RAR, where they had their all different versions of it. And then they were just like, yeah, this isn't good enough. But their hand was forced by the market because of what Bing had done. So it's kind of unfortunate because we all know it's a bad product and it's not like a better experience. But now we're kind of stuck with it because of Wall Street, basically.
Are we stuck with it, do you think?
At least for the short term.
I'm on the fence on this. I still think it seems like the prevalence of them is going down. Presence of AI overviews is going down, especially for like heavily monetized SERPs. I still wouldn't be surprised if we see a total rollback or somehow like combined with knowledge graph or feature snippets in a much less, you know how sometimes you can get like knowledge panels with like a little AI snippet,
Yeah.
which is pre-written. It's more like the Bing ones or
Yeah.
what Bing ones have become. To me, that seems like the logical endpoint here, but obviously Google obviously, yeah, they have to save face somehow, so it's tricky.
Well, I will say they did roll out at Google Marketing Live. They're like, hey, you can buy ads in AI overviews, but like no one's doing it. So I think that is like the bigger marker of it. If that doesn't become a thing that people actually, you know, use, and the cost of AI overviews, like the cost per query is dramatically higher. So I think at some point they will likely abandon it if they can't monetize it, like you're saying.
I think they would have to monetize it crazy well for it to pay, basically. But yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit salty because I did spend a lot of 2023 saying it would be a really bad idea for Google to go ahead and do this, and then they did it. So I'm still sticking to my original guns and saying surely they'll roll this back.
Well, I mean, we saw the negative impact, right? Like the news was all over it. And, you know, like the instances where it was saying things like, oh, yeah, if you have gallstones, like drink urine. Like that's such a brand safety problem for ads. So that's why I was like, how is this going to be something that anyone adopts? And it seems like no one is from a advertising perspective. So I don't think it's going to be something that lasts long term.
I don't see Google wanting to like internationally diverge how the search results work too much. And I can't imagine AI overviews going mass market in the EU, to be honest, at least in anything like their current form. So that creates a bit of a problem as well. Like if they can't, if it just has to be like a bolt-on at the top of the SERP, then that kind of limits what they can do with it.
Yeah, I agree.
Tom, I'm with you. I am also salty about how Search Generative Experience launched so abruptly after Google I/O. I was also on the same train of like, there's no way that this is going to go live in the state that it is, and then it did, and then chaos ensued, and obviously it's been scaled back since. But let's shift gears and talk about AI overviews. I think Mike, you and Garrett have done a lot of work analyzing what happens, what are the mechanics of retrieval augmented generation and how does that influence, placement into an AI overview. My first question is, do either of you actually have data that points to the fact that being selected as a citation within the AI overview is actually beneficial for the website? All right. It's clearly a
There's no
resounding.
Not only that, like everything I've seen suggests that the tactics you might do to win at that game would probably not be tactics you would want to pursue anyway. Just because of their impact on the seemingly higher ROI regular search, or whatever we're calling that now. So yeah, it doesn't seem like a good game to play right now. I'd be interested to be proved wrong, but yeah, that's all I've seen so far.
Wait, what do you mean the tactics that you would do to get in there?
There's so many like spam sites or sites in the wrong geography winning inside AI overviews, right? That if that's what it takes to win, then I'm not sure I want to win.
I mean, there's other ways to win, but like, yeah, I agree with you that we do see a lot of that as of late, at least in the examples that people are sharing publicly. But yeah, as far as getting in there, I mean, it's not too dissimilar from featured snippets, right? Like what we found is it's really about, authoritative statements, citing sources, having quotes in there. And this is a function of like this paper that a few computer scientists put together called generative engine optimization. We basically like went through their stuff and then we basically applied it to what we do. And so it's really just like, it's the same thing. You're optimizing your content for it. And it can be an opportunity because you don't have to rank well in the core web search results to be there, right? Like, because we're seeing instances where you can rank like 80 or something like that, or you can rank for a tangential keyword quite well, and then you end up being in the AI overview there. So there's more, above board ways to do it. It's just we have no evidence that it's actually valuable. But what people don't think about a lot, or at least I don't see talked about a lot, is that organic search is still a branding channel, right? And so I think anyone who's like, oh, I don't want to be in there, or I want to block Chat GPT or whatever, I think it's like you're not thinking about the big picture. If you're not present when someone is like searching for your topic, then you're going to miss out on opportunities to be thought of in that user journey. So, I think especially for the big brands that we work with, they're very adamant, like, how do we get in there, even if they don't know what the actual impact is going to be.
Yeah, I agree with that, to be fair. And to argue against my own point slightly, even if it's not the same things you'd be pursuing to rank for these queries in the regular results, it might not be as antithetical as some of the examples I chose, but it might not be the exact same tactics. How much for an informational query, like historically you might have said, oh, I just want to be in the featured snippet, because as Mike says, it's about the impression rather than the click for a lot of those queries these days. And I think impressions are a metric that SEOs tend to undervalue, or historically at least have tended to undervalue. When you think about how much people spend to appear on a billboard with no attribution whatsoever, there is definitely some value in appearing for those sort of zero click informational queries. But yeah, I think feature snippets is a really good comparison, and especially if, as I'm assuming, AI overviews change a little bit over time, I sort of see them converging probably with feature snippets as well.
Awesome. So then my follow-up question is, okay, featured snippets, AI overviews, perhaps from a traffic and performance perspective, not so good. But thinking about it more as a branding play and getting your brand, whether it be iPullRank or Moz or Clearscope, to surface more real estate on the search engine results page, I think is compelling, but obviously becoming more and more intangible in terms of, measuring performance. So first question is, what is the most reliable way that you found to get placement within an AI overview? And what are the things you've tested and tried? Mike, you've mentioned that it doesn't appear to need, like the AI overview doesn't appear to need content that is, ranking well. It just needs to be somewhere in the SERP and it can qualify for ranking. So what's the most reliable ways that you found to get placements within AI overviews?
Yeah, so the way it works, or the way RAG works, is basically you're extracting chunks or passages from the content that are most relevant to whatever the query was or the prompt was, right? And so that's easy to identify because you can just, well, it's not easy if you don't know anything about vector embeddings, but if you do, you can just vectorize every sentence or every paragraph on your page and then see which one has the highest cosine similarity with the query or the prompt that was given. So once you have that, you know precisely which area to optimize in your content in order to improve. And so from there, it really just goes back to the things I was saying, right? Like that white paper that I mentioned, they tested all the things, right? Like they tested the typical SEO keyword stuffing. They tested just like all the things basically, right? And the three things that they saw were best were citing sources, having more authoritative statements, and what was it, like quotes? Yeah, having quotes in there. And so the thing about that paper that's really valuable is that they did it by testing it out on Perplexity, where they could have like a controlled environment. And they also gave the prompts that they used. And so we basically can use those prompts.
Mike, you muted somehow.
You can use those prompts to do the same sort of optimizations. And I dropped a link in the chat, which talks about, it's Garrett's post where he talked about where he worked through all of this and what he tried, what worked and what didn't. But yeah, I think it's fundamentally like following those three steps is what we've seen work the best. But again, it just goes back to the relevance on a passage level. And then once you find that, you can just like make your adjustments.
Tom, do you have anything to add, or?
I obviously I work tool side, not agency side, so I'm not been doing so many experiments with these. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. It makes sense. I think it's interesting that when you talk about quotes, authoritative statements, it is kind of similar to the things that people say about feature snippet optimizations, right? Like it's definitely compatible, which to me is important, in that I wouldn't want to right now be pursuing tactics that were only relevant for AI overviews. But that's not necessarily the case.
So this is a theory that I've been having, which is, looking at and maybe potentially segueing into, the Google API document leaks, is that I've been thinking that this whole like AI overview is actually just a completely different algorithm than, what the SERPs are offering, right? It's like the AI overview is particularly looking at, semantic similarity through word vector embeddings and all of these different things. And to a degree, they're not being as informed or using the whole user engagement signal stuff as much as, the classical 10 blue links tend to do. So what are your thoughts on, is Google's algorithm now this like two algorithm kind of centric model?
Yeah,
And
yeah, pretty
does
much.
the AI overview basically, are we just getting infusions of Gemini and the generative experience there? And essentially, are you setting yourself up to be dominant in an AI-driven world by optimizing for AI overviews, and then we're playing the user engagement signal game with the 10 blue links? What do y'all think about that?
Yeah,
Yeah. So, oh, go
go on,
ahead,
Mike.
Tom. No, you.
We did some studies on this with stats, and there's basically no, or maybe it looks more like negative than positive relation between AI overview ranking and regular ranking. It's for sure a totally different system. As you say, probably more to do with Gemini than it is to do with regular Google ranking. To me, the interesting question is whether it can stay that way. Like, surely there has to be some convergence just from the point of view of efficiency and having the same index and this kind of thing. At the moment, you have this weird situation where there's, a robots.txt user agent or user agent rule you might use to block Gemini, and another one for Google regular search, but AI overviews use the regular Google search one, but seem like they work more on Gemini. I would think that has to simplify over time, but hard to say for sure.
So I think the first thing to note is that, Google's algorithm is a series of microservices to begin with. And so when you talk about AI overviews, that's just a specific microservice that generates this block of copy, basically. I mean, not just copy, there's other elements to it as well. And so it would really just take um, the results as an input. And so being that we're seeing that there are things that don't necessarily rank well in the core web search, I suspect that they're pulling it, because the way they've structured the index at this point, they have like a vectorized version of all pages, and they've also got, the standard a lexical version of the index as well. So I would imagine that they're pulling the most relevant pages from the vectorized side, and then again pulling the most relevant chunks from there, and then feeding that to the language model to then generate what the response is. As far as it being Gemini, I mean, it could be at this point, but when they rolled it out and they had the whole technical documentation, they said it was a combination of Palm 2 and Mum that's used to generate the actual response. So, I mean, I think when we talk about Google's algorithm, just for simplicity, we're saying it like it's this giant equation or whatever that, all pages run through. The reality is that different components or different series of microservices get triggered based on the query and the context and things like that. So I don't think it's ever, just one algorithm that we're considering. It's always like a combination of things.
Yeah, to me, that was one of the most interesting takeaways of the leak earlier this year, was how modular the system seems to be just for regular Google core ranking. I do think there's something interesting to me in, I don't know if you saw, there's a bunch of examples when we were still calling them SGEs, when Google was still calling them SGEs, where there were verbatim quotes from other content that then weren't cited as one of the sources. So that makes me think that the list of sources or featured articles, whatever we want to call them, is not necessarily even the same system as what's writing the content blurb in the at the top of the SERP. Which again, I mean, I'm starting to become a stuck record. It's kind of like in feature snippets, how often you'll get the image, which is the top image result, and it kind of looks like they're sort of implying it came from the article that they're quoting, but they're not. It's just the top image result put next to an article from a different source. So I don't necessarily think it's even as simple as, oh, if you write something that is useful for them to construct their summary at the top of the SERP, then you will be featured as a URL. I'm sure it helps, don't get me wrong, but there's definitely more going on than that.
Yeah, and one more thing, like it seems to get around a lot of things, like we're saying, like it doesn't do all the spam filtering, links don't seem to matter so much. So again, I think it's a separate system that has its own series of rules that we can play within in order to get that visibility.
Yeah, let's talk about playing with it, testing it, and experimentation. This is one of the first audience-related questions. Nicholas asks, how do we improve the culture of testing and sharing insights with the SEO community? I know the both of you have been, fairly vocal about how we as the SEO community have sort of regressed into, not as much testing and sharing. I also understand it's kind of a double-edged proposition in that if I do find a test or experiment that goes wildly well, I'm not that incentivized to talk about it, because then, that as a tactic or strategy gets saturated. So how do you think we should or could improve the culture? And are there any recent tests or experiments that you would be willing to share that you've seen happen with now the Google Leaks document being, so widely available?
The first thing I would say to a question like this always is shout out to the Search Pilot newsletter. They do a lot of very well constructed, very rigorous on-page SEO tests on typically on-page, not always, typically on-page SEO tests on enterprise sites. Because one of the challenges for any kind of SEO testing is it's actually really difficult to be robust, because it's not like, A/B testing that you might do for conversion rate or something like this. There's so many things that are outside of your control. Like you can change something about your site, then your competitor can change something about their site, and you see a change in traffic, and you might not even know that your competitor did anything, so you're going to falsely attribute it. And the chances are, well, at least one of your competitors is changing something every day, right? If you're in a remotely competitive vertical. So there's a lot going on that is difficult to control for there. And I think that's some of why we don't see too many tests, apart from I think Cyrus did one recently where he disavowed his entire link portfolio or something. Like those kind of extreme tests obviously can be more clear cut. In terms of sharing and experiments and data, so something that I often think about is ranking factor studies. So Moz, for those of you that may not remember, Moz used to do a quite exhaustive ranking factor study up until 2015. And it's something we occasionally talk about revisiting. But the challenge is in interpretation, and specifically misinterpretation. Like as soon as you put out a correlation study like that, you're going to find things where, so, okay, I know, really obvious example, links correlate with rankings. Now we're pretty sure that's causal, but there's a lot more going on there, right? Like links and rankings are both caused by media coverage, for example. Like if you get coverage that will result in both links and rankings because of promotion of your brand, like Chrome traffic data, etc., and it will result in, and the fact that you rank will then also result in both more coverage and more links and more rankings. And there's all of these sort of mechanisms going to and forth. So even with a really obvious example like links, it can be very difficult to break apart. And then on top of that, even apart from the sort of misinterpretation angle, actually the measurement angle can be difficult as well, for all the reasons we just talked about with sort of external variables and this kind of thing. So yeah, it's a bit of a minefield. I still think there's a place for that kind of data and study, but you have to look at it with like a very critical eye, basically.
I think the difficulty with testing as a culture in our space is that structurally we're not really doing things that are easily reproducible. Because we always say things like, oh, all things being equal, all things are never equal, right? Like it's hard to ever say that. And so even if someone like gives you all the data and says like, oh, do the same thing on your website, it could turn out completely differently. But I would like for us as a community to say like, okay, here's what the structure of a test needs to look like. Here is the things that we think should be reproducible. And if we're going to publicly share something, like everything needs to be delivered on this level. So like, here was the methodology, here is the structure of what we did, here's the examples, like all these things should be laid out, and we should hold our community to that level. And so that's what I love about what Search Pilot is doing, because they share a lot of their information, right? Like they talk to you about methodology, they've continued to improve the product. One of my big criticisms had always been, well, you guys aren't looking at whether or not those pages were actually crawled in that time frame. So you don't even know if Google picked up those changes. And so recently they've added the ability to do that as well. Not to say they did it because of me. I'm just saying it was one of my common criticisms of anything in this space, because no one was doing that, but now they're doing it. So I just really appreciate the rigor that comes from that team as it relates to testing. Because I feel like a lot of the tests that are presented in blog posts or people talk about anecdotally, they're not structured well enough for you to like believe in them. And so I think it's really important to have a good, testing methodology. But beyond that, I mean, we do a lot of testing, right? Like a lot of things that are considered best practices, we found aren't really the thing you should do. So as an example, page titles, right? Like the best practice in the SEO space is like, it's going back and forth from like 60 to 70 characters. Sometimes people say pixel width and things like that. So most people, I would assume a lot of people even on this call are like, oh yeah, I write my titles that way. But what we found is that Google will consider everything that you provide in that tag, even if they don't show it. And in some cases, they'll use the extra to like rewrite the title. So every time we test it out where we make it longer and include more keywords, things that we would typically consider keyword stuffing, it works better. Like you get higher rankings, you get better click-through rate and so on. So I think it's really valuable to question all of those best practices continually as you can, and just keep testing so you can see what works for you.
Definitely. Yeah, I have just an earlier like test that we did regarding meta descriptions. And this is a while back. I would say probably like 8 years ago. We like updated the meta descriptions on a directory style website, think like Yelp and TripAdvisor, those types. And we like cratered the click-through rate as a result. And what we found was that, Google was automatically generating meta descriptions based off of the body of content. And when we overwrote, or when we suggested to Google that these were the preferred meta descriptions, they actually took that as the suggestion and overwrote their own like generated descriptions. And as a result, the click-through rates like cratered. And from that moment on, I've actually just been on the train where it's like, no, we don't provide meta descriptions. Like the meta description is just generated from the body of content. And I feel like we as a community have so many of those where, yeah, meta description, 160 characters or whatever, and that's just like what you do, right?
I
Yeah.
do think Mike's right. Like I've seen this kind of thing go both ways. I think I've seen that specific tactic go both ways. And it can be like incredibly vertical or site specific. What is gonna work for you? Like the particularly things around like meta descriptions, things, people say, put numbers in title tags. People say don't put some like SEO copy on category pages. This stuff is really hard to predict, honestly. Like I can't predict whether that's gonna work or not for your site. You just have to try it.
Yeah, the meta description thing, we always test that one for the very same reason that you just said, Bernard. But the reality that you got to think about is, again, Google is trying to orient towards, driving the best experience. And so they have like a whole snippet brain microservice where they're generating the snippets in alignment with the queries. And so because they have so much data to indicate like what's going to be successful from a clicking perspective, why wouldn't you leverage them? I think that we have had this conceit as SEOs, like, oh, we can write better copy that's going to yield better click-through rates. And in some cases that can be true, depending on the industry, the keyword, so on. But in most cases, Google's going to write a better version because of the scale of their operation.
Definitely. Well, let's really dive into the audience questions at this point. We only got 15 minutes left. I think there's a lot of people who are wondering what they should be doing about SEO. So just a very point blank question. What do y'all think are the top 3 things that we as SEOs should be considering to do right now to set ourselves up for success in the next 5, 10 years?
I think if you were a reasonably forward-thinking SEO in like 2016, 17, 18, I think you are probably already on a lot of the right tracks here. Like a lot of the things that we've learned, as in we found out for sure in the last year, particularly thanks to the leak, thanks to the US versus Google case, thanks to experimentation in the industry. A lot of the we found out that click data is used. We found out more about how Google understands and experiments with pages. I think, to be honest, that some of that isn't really news. So I would probably, for me, I'd start by giving you a top 1. Like there's an overwhelming winner for me, which is brand. Like you have to be a site that people want to visit, that they're going to pick out in search results, that they're going to consider trustworthy. That there are some sites that Google can't afford not to rank, right? Because if Google doesn't rank them, the user is just going to go and find them. Arguably, Reddit became one of those, but there are other obvious examples. Think about certain media sites, think about Amazon, this kind of thing. So I think maybe you can't replicate it at that scale, but be a brand would be my biggest sort of single piece of advice, and that's been true for a long time now, and I don't think it's going anywhere. And the nice thing about that is, as some people are alluding to in their questions, if Google, and I think Google's position is pretty hard to assault if you're a competitor, but if Google doesn't win this race on that tiny chance, it's very likely that whatever comes next will also heavily depend on you being a recognized brand.
Yeah, I would echo that. Way I break it down is in 3 different categories, right? Like I think it's all about relevance, authority, and user experience. And the user experience thing, I think we've neglected to some degree as an SEO community because that's considered someone else's job. But I don't think we can allow that anymore because of the fact that we now know definitively that Google is using those signals as a mechanism to reinforce what should rank. And so to that end, you've got to make your content experience get the user to what they're looking for as fast as possible, right? And the example I always use is recipe sites. Like no one wants the 500-word article about your grandmother's recipe and how she, tripped over a cat and knocked too much sugar in, and now that's the recipe. Like no one cares, right? So you need to structure your pages so it's easy for people to find what they're looking for. And I think people are concerned. It's like, oh, well, maybe they'll come really fast and then leave. Well, just because someone bounces or leaves quickly doesn't necessarily mean that's an unsuccessful session. So when someone comes to your recipe page, can't find the recipe, leaves and goes and looks at someone else's, that's an unsuccessful session. So I think user experience is a big part of it. But I think also because we're in this large language model environment, we need to really adopt structured data, not in the way that we've done historically, where it's like, okay, just use the vocabularies that give you rich results. Large language models use everything from structured data. So mark it up with all the vocabularies that are relevant to your page, so you have more opportunities for your brand to appear for these different prompts that people put in. So those are my main issues. I would also say with link building, I think we've all historically heard or said like, oh, quality over quantity, but that was never ever actually quantified, right? Like it was quantified through the lens of things like domain authority, citation flow, all these measures that we've created as the community that don't necessarily match what Google is doing, but they are like a way for us to compare sites next to each other. But now we have a much better idea of how they're looking at quality. And the proxies that I would use would be how much traffic does this page get, and then also how many rankings does it have, right? Because now we know it's going to live in a higher end or higher partition within the index, and they're applying more value to that. So, you know, when I look at people's link profiles and the various tools, and I look at the traffic measures, which of course are directional, most of these pages have 0. And so I would say, like, focus more on getting the links from pages that drive more of those metrics so that you can get more value without having to like sandblast the web with terrible links.
100%. I think if the domain authority, which is a Moz metric, so I suppose I'm responsible for this problem to some degree, but I think domain authority is something that people often fixate on with links. I think if you want to use a metric like this, for starters, I would start with page authority. Like Google's original algorithm, it was about its page rank, right? It's about the page that's linking to you, not the domain that's linking to you. But B, they were trying to approximate the original goal of PageRank, sort of the white paper, was to approximate the popularity of web pages. They were trying to simulate where a random user on the web would be. That's what PageRank does. So you have to imagine that if Google was trying to simulate where it's trying to estimate popularity for all that time, and they now have that data themselves, they probably have better data on that than anyone has ever done, then the popularity of a page that you're, as in the number of people visiting a page that you're getting a link from, is surely very, very relevant. The other thing I would add to the original question, which is almost certainly bad news for a lot of SEO departments, is if we agree that brand and user signals are two of the most important things in SEO, then probably one of the most tactically important things is product. Like the thing that you're actually selling needs to be very good, and that can be obviously potentially impossible for an SEO team to affect, but it is a huge factor.
I love how y'all both framed your answers, and I have a couple of follow-up questions based off of what you said. I think that brand is a consistent word and theme and propaganda that Google continues to use. And I think one of the issues that I have with it, and perhaps the SEO community has with it, is that it's so ethereal. It's so intangible, right? What is a brand? You know, we know the New York Times, we know, CNET or whatever, and those in our eyes are brands, but from a, more calculatable and objective measure, what are the things that, we could track as an SEO to say that we are improving our brand? One idea is, navigational searches, which Tom, you were mentioning, right? If you Google, domain authority and Moz isn't there, I might go back and Google domain authority Moz, therefore training the algorithm that Moz should be part of that SERP. But yeah, what are y'all's thoughts on how we can actually measure how strong or weak our brand are?
I'm going to defer to Tom because I know they have a product for this.
I was going to say, I think I'm contractually obliged to mention the Moz brand authority beta at this stage, available for just $5 a month in our API. But in all seriousness, that is a metric you can use, but I think there are also leading indicators you can use as well. We talked about one earlier, right? We talked about impressions. Like if you're looking for something that you can directly tactically affect, I think same as domain authority. I don't want to see people in the industry trying to like manipulate their brand authority because they think it'll affect their rankings or something like this. Like brand authority is a metric that can give you an indicator of how authoritative a brand is, shock horror, but it's perhaps not the thing that you should be trying to do to move the needle. The tactical things are, for example, impressions, for example, having content that people want to cite or consider authoritative, for example, having a great experience on your site. Like those are the ways that will make people, those are the things that will make people seek you out, right? So yeah, I would start with those, and then metrics like brand authority or like branded search will hopefully follow.
Definitely. Well, Couple of now, again, future oriented things. Last two questions I'm going to be asked. Ong asks, might be jumping the gun, but would be great if you could answer this when we're talking about what's likely next for search. There is SEO for TikTok, YouTube, Amazon, generative engine optimization. Do you think demands for such skill sets will take off, or has it already? And how do y'all think about the future of this multi-platform, very fractured ecosystem that we're entering?
Yeah, I think the way that people are getting their information needs met is changing. They have more options again. But at the same time, Google's still the main show in town, right? Like there's been a number of studies. You can go into any tool like SimilarWeb and compare the traffic to ChatGPT versus Google. Like it doesn't even register on the scale when you compare them. So I don't think it's going to be easy to supplant what Google is. Like even with this search GPT thing, I think it's going to be very difficult to exit the Google ecosystem because Google had like so much of what we use on a day-to-day is Google, right? So it's very difficult for everyone's behavior to change and then go to this new platform. But to that point, I mean, yeah, there's certainly people optimizing for TikTok, optimizing for, ChatGPT specifically. I know the SEER team is now tracking rankings in ChatGPT based on different prompts and so on. So yeah, people are doing it. And as far as like, do you need to add it to your skill set? Well, yes, if it works for your brand or your business, then you should figure out how to optimize there. It's the same as like learning how to do App Store optimization or optimizing for Amazon A9 or A10 or whatever it's called now. If it comes up, it's worth doing, but I don't know that you're going to absolutely have to learn all these different channels.
I'd say two things. One is I found it interesting in the US versus Google case. Google tried to make the argument that things like TikTok and Amazon and Facebook are to some degree Google competitors, and thus they're not a monopoly, and that was thrown out. I think that's maybe a mistake. Like if something supplants Google in that sort of dominant position long term, I would imagine it's something that doesn't look too much like Google. That said, I don't think it's ChatGPT. I think ChatGPT is a niche tool compared to something like Google. The way I think about it is Google is like a supermarket. They're a one-size-fits-all tool that works for like 90-something% of your search needs very well. They don't need to be like better than ChatGPT at the things ChatGPT is good at. They don't need to be better than Amazon at the things Amazon is good at. They just need to be good enough that it's not worth you going to that special dedicated place and having that specific app. In the same way that you probably don't have a weather app on your phone because the weather results you get in Google search results are good enough. Are they as good as the weather app? No, but they're fine. They're okay. So you will keep coming back to Google, and other consumers will keep coming back to Google as long as they continue being that like very broad tool that is mostly good enough for all of your search needs.
Well, we're coming up right on the hour, and typically I like to ask, what's your future thoughts, this and that. We've covered all of that. So I'm going to flip it on its head for our final question, which is, we as SEOs do a lot. We optimize our content for relevance and quality. We build links, we fix our technical SEO issues, and we're now getting into this realm of recommending our design team, fix our page user experience. And now we're talking about how we also need to sell a fantastic and great product and how that's going to matter in the future. So we do a lot. That's the long story short. What do you think is something that a lot of SEOs currently do that they should just stop doing and stop, giving two craps about?
Volume-based link building.
Yeah, that's got to be a vertical specific tactic at best at this point. Like I could imagine maybe in Europe there's a lot of gambling sites, and I understand that volume-based link building works better for those guys than it does in most other verticals. But yeah, I agree. Not only is it probably not particularly effective, it also just like degrades the quality of the web in general. So please stop. My less obvious, I guess, or less I'm less confident take would be, I think SEOs, not, we said at the start of the call, maybe this loops it back nicely, that if you want to generate a personal brand in SEO, then maybe you should specialize and be the expert in one thing. I think that might be true for SEOs just career-wise in general at this point. The SEO is growing up as an industry. It's becoming an incredibly diverse set of skills. Like there are very few SEOs now who are really experts in like the whole spectrum of things that we include in like an SEO department's responsibilities or whatever. So I think if you are an SEO that overlaps a bit with PR, or an SEO that overlaps a little bit with the technical side, or an SEO that overlaps a little bit with content strategy, not only is that probably better for you as an SEO, but it also sort of future-proofs you against whatever does happen with Google or whatever comes next.
Awesome. Love it. And thank the both of you so much for joining us, sharing your deep well of knowledge in SEO, especially again, as we see, I think, the most dramatic changes in volatility that we've ever seen come to search so far. It's a complete honor, and I think that everybody here really got a lot out of this talk. We'd love to have you back at some point, just given how crazy everything has. So if you'll have us, well, if you'll come back, we would love to have you. And again, thank you so much for spending your time here.